they have done the figures for the last 3 months. It is a total of 437 billion shillings they say they have borrowed domestically. That 437 is 4.8 billion shillings per day. It is equivalent to 202 million per hour. It is equivalent to 3.8 million shillings per minute. And it is equivalent to 56,000 shillings per second. That is what your government is doing. That domestic borrowing is our money. And what they cannot do and service that way, they try and come back to us in taxation. That's why the tax bill was so horrendous last year. And the young community of this country got up to fight it because it was punitive to each and every one of us. So there is a total collapse of this nation happening every day before our eyes. March 2014, Duale brings a bill to amend Section 17 of the Public Finance Management Act to add C and D. The Constitution, Public Finance 2012, had A and B, the two exceptions I've said, but now he goes to Parliament to amend Public Finance Management Act Section 17 and add C and D. And C and D are to do with the loans to be taken by the government, that they do not have to come to central bank. They can fly all over the world. It can even go to a contractor. It can go to a freight person. It can go to a whatever entity. It is very broad in its description. But it does not have to enter the Republic of Kenya. It does not have to enter our central bank. The illegality is that you cannot change the Constitution of Kenya through statute law, inferior law. You cannot. The Constitution is supreme. So what should have happened is that you go and you get 2/3 of Parliament to amend 206 of the Constitution. And once you amend it, then you impart it in Public Finance Management Act. And they knew that. But they knew if they do that, it would raise concern. Why are you amending the Constitution this early in your regime? And everyone would refuse because you're advertising that you're saying money does not have to come to central bank. Now, the key thing about money coming to the consolidated fund is that that is where we have oversight. And oversight goes like this. First and foremost, the controller of budget has oversight on any withdrawals from the consolidated fund. That is the law. So any withdrawal, any exchequer issue, if you're paying for anything, that is mainly, she only authorizes what is in the budget. She must approve the exit of any money from the consolidated fund. And it must align with the budget that has been passed by Parliament. Number two, and this is critical, the Auditor General also can only audit accounts in the consolidated fund. Any other place they cannot audit. They have no sight of. So it was also to make sure that they have no sight of what is happening with the debt. So let's go to debt, because C and D amendments were to do with debt. So let us go to the debt. So from independent Kenya, 40 years until Mwai Kibaki left uongozi wa Kenya in 2013, we had a total of 1.8 trillion in our total debt of 40 years. Total debt of 40 years, 1.8 trillion. Please note, I'm saying 40 years. From 2013, call it 2014, because that was Uhuru's first budget, to 2022, can roughly say 8 years. Our debt moved from 1.8 trillion to roughly 9.4 trillion. Because by the time he was handing over, it was 9.4. You can say the end of the financial year, June, it was 8.7, but he still had a budget. So you can say either 8.7 or 9.4. The sum total means this, that in just a period of 8 years, our debt had increased by another 7 trillion. Uhuru borrowed 7 trillion. trillion shillings in 8 years, whereas we as a country for 40 years only had a cumulative of 1.8 trillion. So he said, wow, 7 trillion. Who is borrowing? What exactly is going on here? Where did this money go? Now, Article 220 of the Constitution, subsection 1, is very clear about government budget. All expenditure must be in the budget. All revenue and all expenditure, development and recurrent, must be in the budget. And any deficit, subsection 2, must also be in the budget. So if you have a shortfall of the revenue vis-a-vis expenditure, it must be in the budget. So the first thing we did was say, what did the budget of Kenya, in other words, through Parliament, through what is called the Appropriations Act, pass for in those 8 years as the approved deficit, in other words, the loan, because that is the law that is passed. Not papers, not budget policy papers, all this nonsense that they keep telling you. It is the Appropriation Act that anchors the debt of the country and all the expenditure. So we said, how much did Parliament pass? Now you are talking about Parliament. This is where you know how oversight has not been there. So Parliament passes, because if you go to Section 50 of the Public Finance Management Act, it says you can only take debt for development. So if there is a deficit, it can only go towards development. That's where the shortfall is. So Parliament, in the 8 years of Uhuru Kenyatta, passes a total debt to be taken, approved for projects, nothing else, of 2 trillion in 8 years. So how did he take 7 trillion? 5 trillion above what was passed. 5 trillion shillings that is not on the budget of Kenya, that is not approved for any project in Kenya. And this is where we started drawing some very many interesting questions. We also looked to see how much of our taxes had gone towards payment of debt. And during Uhuru's years, we had paid a total of 5.6 trillion towards debt. So he said, this is not making sense, because at the end of his years, it is still showing 8.7 or 9.4, depending on what you want to take, the actual months, outstanding. How do we pay 5.6? Parliament only approved 2 trillion. He takes 7, 5 above what is approved. We pay 5.6, and yet we are still owing 9+ trillion or so. Something is extremely wrong. Now, for Kenyans, I think it's important to understand that this is the crux of all our economic and our social problems, because this has a direct bearing on our lives. When Kibaki left in the year 2013, tax revenue, the amount of money the government collects from us, of every 100 shillings, or let me even start with 10 shillings, of every 10 shillings, right? Or 100, let me just go back to 100. Of every 100 shillings, Kibaki was paying 18 shillings of that 100 shillings towards debt servicing, paying debt that had been taken. When Uhuru left power in 2022, we were paying 65 to 68%, 68 shillings of every 100 shillings towards debt servicing. Frightening figure. They normally say that if you cross 30, you are a bankrupt nation. We were at 68% of tax revenue. I see a lot of the media make put revenue all together, even borrowed revenue, they put it together and they calculate how much of that is going to debt. No, you take tax revenue, what comes from us? Because in the budget, it is our tax revenue that pays for debt. That's the only legal thing that can pay for debt. Borrowed revenue cannot pay for debt. Borrowed revenue can only pay and service development, not debt. So it's our tax revenue. It was 68 shillings of every 100 going to debt. Today, and I want to give you some very frightening figures. Very frightening figures. The last 4 months of this financial year, 96 shillings of every 100 is going to debt. We are left with 4 shillings. And what people don't understand is that those 4 shillings cannot run a government. So the government goes into the market to borrow. And that borrowing, they say, right, is called domestic financing, which they say they pass in a budget policy statement. But that domestic financing is not in the appropriations bill, is not in the Appropriation Act. It is not passed as part of the budget as debt to be taken for development. It does not exist. Now, they need, all right, to give you a sum total, they need 40 shillings above the 96 to give to the counties. So they are negative 36, they borrow. They need another 60 shillings for salaries. They are negative 96. In order that government doesn't come down on its operations, in other words, petrol for police cars and so on, they need another 30. You're now seeing they're over 100 in just the last 4 months, borrowing above what they're collecting. This is not sustainable. But just to give you a quantum, they have done the figures for the last 3 months. It is a total of 437 billion shillings they say they have borrowed domestically. That 437 is 4.8 billion shillings per day. It is equivalent to 202 million per hour. It is equivalent to 3.8 million shillings per minute. And it is equivalent to 56,000 shillings per second. That is what your government is doing. That domestic borrowing is our money. And what they cannot do and service that way, they try and come back to us in taxation. That's why the tax bill was so horrendous last year. And the young community of this country got up to fight it because it was punitive to each and every one of us. But they have not stopped. They are still coming back at us with services from e-government services. It is a tax. They say they passed the housing fund and they are collecting and building houses like a big joke. But the housing fund is a deduction on somebody's income. It's income tax, a double taxation. And this must be challenged in our courts. The other day, they are talking about an infrastructure fund. Again, no matter which way he takes it, that is double. Double whether you're taking it from companies you're selling off, because we invested in those companies. You can't tell us you're selling off KPA from our money that we contributed from our taxes to build, and then you say you're taking the money somewhere else. No, no, no. You're already collecting taxes from us to build roads. It is in the budget. If you cannot fund it, admit the truth. It is because you have no money because you are paying debt. So you are no longer able to do any development. You are no longer able to give services to Kenyans. Stop pretending, right? And it seems apparent that this unhinged charlatan is so keen on making sure he does not default on debt that he is prepared to sacrifice everything else, but not that. But he's defaulting. He's defaulting in counties. Pensioners are not getting their money. He's defaulting on services. He's defaulting on development. A third of our budget should go to development. So there is a total collapse of this nation happening every day before our eyes.